Her stepmother sold her to a cold billionaire, but he became obsessed with her. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. The grandfather clock. In the hallway struck midnight, its deep resonance echoing through the empty corridors of the Carter mansion. Megan sat perched on the window seat of her bedroom, watching raindrops race down the glass panes. Each drop carried a memory of better days, when her father's laughter still filled these halls, and home meant more than just four walls and a roof. "You can't hide up here forever, dear." Victoria's voice sliced through the silence, dripping with false sweetness. Megan's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. Her stepmother's reflection in the window was enough. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, red lips curved in a predatory smile, and eyes that had never shown an ounce of warmth since the day Megan's father died. "I'm not hiding," Megan replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm thinking. About your father's debt, or perhaps about the generous offer Mr. Blackwood has made?" Victoria glided into the room, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Really, Megan, you should be thanking me. How many 21-year-old nobodies get the chance to marry one of America's most eligible bachelors?" The word marry caught in Megan's throat like a shard of glass. George Blackwood, the billionaire CEO whose face graced every business magazine, whose name was whispered in boardrooms with equal parts fear and respect. She'd seen him only once, at her father's funeral. He'd stood in the back, surveying the proceedings with the same cold calculation he probably used to evaluate his business acquisitions. "It's not a marriage." Megan finally turned to face her stepmother, green eyes blazing. "It's a transaction. You're selling me to pay off Daddy's supposed debts." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "Oh, darling, your father may have spoiled you with fairy tales about true love, but this is the real world. Marriage has always been about advantage, and trust me, the advantages Mr. Blackwood offers are substantial." She pulled an envelope from her designer purse and tossed it onto Megan's bed. "The contract. He wants your answer by tomorrow morning." Megan's gaze fell to the envelope, its crisp white surface somehow more threatening than any weapon. "And if I refuse?" "Then the bank takes everything. The house, the company, every last penny your father worked for. His legacy will be nothing but shame and bankruptcy." Victoria moved closer, her perfume suffocating in its intensity. "And you'll be out on the street with nothing but your pretty face and your father's failed dreams to keep you warm." The truth of it hit Megan like a physical blow. Her father's company, the one he'd built from nothing, the one that employed hundreds of people, would collapse. All those families, all those lives destroyed, because she couldn't bear the thought of being George Blackwood's trophy wife. "Why did you do it?" Megan whispered, her voice raw. "Why did you marry my father if you were just going to destroy everything he built?" For a moment something flickered in Victoria's eyes, not guilt, but something closer to triumph. "Your father was a fool who believed in love, just like you, and look where it got him." She turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "Mr. Blackwood's driver will be here at 9 tomorrow morning. Be ready to sign the contract, or be ready to leave. The choice is yours." After Victoria's footsteps faded, Megan returned to her vigil. At the window, the rain had stopped, leaving the world outside gleaming and unfamiliar. On her dresser sat the only photograph she had of her mother, a beautiful woman with Megan's same green eyes and determination, who died when Megan was too young to remember more than the echo of her laughter. "What would you do, Mom?" she whispered to the photograph. But of course, there was no answer. There never was. With trembling fingers, Megan picked up the envelope. The contract inside was cold and precise. 12 pages of legal terminology that basically amounted to selling herself into a loveless marriage. 1 year minimum, Public appearances required, discretion mandatory, and at the bottom, a figure with enough zeros to make her head spin. This was the price of freedom, not her own, but the freedom of all those people who depended on her father's company. Their jobs, their families, their futures. Megan Carter had always dreamed of true love, just like in the stories her father used to read to her. But as she watched the first rays of dawn paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, she realized some dreams had to die so others could live. Tomorrow she would sign her life away to a man who saw love as a weakness and marriage as a business strategy. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. George Blackwood. But tonight, just for these last few hours, she allowed herself to cry for the girl she used to be and for all the dreams she would never get to chase. Blackwood Industries occupied the top 10 floors of a glass and steel monolith in downtown Boston. Megan watched her reflection fragment and multiply across the mirrored elevator walls as it climbed to the penthouse level. The woman staring back at her seemed like a stranger, hair swept into an elegant chignon, wearing a conservative navy dress that Victoria had generously provided, perfect packaging for a business transaction. The elevator chimed softly, and Megan stepped into a reception area where modern art pieces worth more than her father's house lined the walls. A sleek desk stretched across the space like a barrier, behind which sat an impeccably dressed woman with steel-grey hair and glasses that matched the building's architecture. "Miss Carter," the woman stated rather than asked. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. Follow me." They moved through a series of corridors, each turn taking them deeper into George Blackwood's domain. Megan's heels sank into plush carpeting that muffled every step, creating an unsettling silence. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, crafted from dark wood and polished to a mirror shine. "Sir," the assistant announced, "Miss Carter has arrived." George Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the door, a dark silhouette against Boston's skyline. He didn't turn immediately, and Megan felt the deliberate power play in his pause. When he finally faced her, his expression was as impassive as she remembered from her father's funeral. "Miss Carter." His voice was deep, controlled, with the faintest trace of an accent she couldn't place. "Please sit." Megan moved to one of the leather chairs facing his massive desk, noting how everything in the room seemed designed to emphasize the occupant's power. The elevated position of his chair, the stark modern art that spoke of wealth and sophisticated taste, the carefully curated view of his business empire below. "I assume you've reviewed the contract?" He settled into his chair, dark eyes studying her with the same intensity he might use to evaluate a corporate acquisition. "Yes." Megan was proud that her voice remained steady. "Though I have a question about Clause 17. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation. "The confidentiality agreement?" "No. The clause about public appearances." Megan met his gaze directly. "It states that I'm required to attend any event you deem necessary for business purposes. I'd like to amend that to include reasonable notice and exclude any dates that conflict with my volunteer work." At the Children's Hospital, George leaned back slightly, and for the first time, something like interest crossed his features. "You work with children?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday I read to them, help with art therapy." She lifted her chin. "It's non-negotiable." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Nothing in this contract is non-negotiable, Miss Carter. You're hardly in a position to make demands." "Then why did you choose me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Excuse me? There must be dozens of women who jump at the chance to be Mrs. George Blackwood. Society women who understand your world, who wouldn't need careful handling in public." Megan leaned forward slightly. "So why pick the awkward stepdaughter of a woman you clearly despise?" George stood abruptly, moving to a cabinet that probably cost more than a car. He removed 2 crystal glasses and a decanter of amber liquid. Your stepmother approached me with an interesting proposition. She needed money. I needed a wife who wouldn't have expectations. He poured 2 drinks with precise movements. You have a reputation for being intelligent, discreet, and most importantly, uninterested in the social climbing that seems to occupy most of Boston's eligible women. He offered her one of the glasses. Megan accepted it but didn't drink. So, you bought yourself a recluse. I bought myself peace of mind. He returned to his desk, swirling the liquid in his glass. 1 year of marriage, public appearances when necessary, no emotional entanglements. In return, your father's company survives, and you receive financial independence from your stepmother. A mutually beneficial arrangement. Megan studied the man before her, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her car, not a hair out of place, every movement carefully controlled. But there was something in his eyes, a shadow that spoke of deeper waters than his corporate persona suggested. Fine. She set down her untouched drink. I'll agree to the public appearances with 48 hours' notice, excluding my hospital commitments. In return, I want something added to the contract. George's eyebrows rose fractionally. And that would be, when this year is over, I want your help destroying Victoria's control over my father's estate. Megan watched his reaction carefully. I know she's been embezzling. I just can't prove it yet. For a long moment, George said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Mrs. Richards, he called to his assistant, please have Clause 17 amended as Miss Carter suggested, and add a new section regarding post-marriage financial investigations. The assistant appeared silently, collected the contract, and disappeared again. George rose, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. The papers will be ready in 10 minutes. In the meantime, there's something you should see. He led her to a door hidden in the wood paneling, opening it to reveal a private elevator. They rode in silence to the building's top floor, emerging into what was clearly his private domain. The space was surprisingly warm, with rich woods and leather, massive bookshelves, and windows that made the city below look like a toy model. This will be your home, he stated matter-of-factly. The East Wing is yours entirely. I'll respect your privacy, and I expect the same courtesy. Megan wandered to the windows, taking in the view. A gilded cage is still a cage, Mr. Blackwood. George. His reflection appeared behind her in the glass. If we're to convince the world we're in love, you should probably use my first name. She turned to face him, struck by how his height seemed even more imposing in this intimate setting. And is that what we're doing? Convincing the world we're in love? We're convincing the world that I'm not the cold bastard they think I am. His eyes met hers with unexpected intensity. And you're convincing them that you're not a gold digger who trapped Boston's most eligible bachelor. We each have our parts to play. The assistant's discreet cough interrupted them. She held out the revised contract, and Megan felt the weight of the moment settle around her like a cloak. This was it, the point of no return. With steady hands, she took the pen George offered and signed her name on the dotted line. His signature followed, bold and decisive, sealing their fate. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Blackwood, he said, but his eyes held a warning. This wasn't a fairy tale, and he certainly wasn't Prince Charming. Megan nodded once, already missing the weight of her father's surname. Thank you, George. I hope we both get what we want from this arrangement. But as she followed him back to the elevator, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with a devil she didn't fully understand, one whose demons might end up consuming them both. 3 minutes, George's voice came through the intercom, as precise and unyielding as a military command. Megan stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, counting breaths like her father had taught her before important presentations. 1 week into their marriage, and already she was learning that George Blackwood ran his personal life with the same ruthless efficiency as his business empire. The dress he'd had delivered was a masterpiece in midnight blue silk, cut to suggest rather than reveal. The designer label whispered old money, while the classic styling declared conservative taste. Everything calculated, everything controlled, just like the man himself. Megan opened her clutch, checking one last time for the small silver compass. That had been her father's. George had raised an eyebrow when she'd insisted on carrying the battered thing to their first charity gala, but some battles were worth fighting. She needed this small piece of her old life, this reminder of who she really was. 2 minutes. The intercom crackled again, and Megan rolled her eyes. "I'm coming," she muttered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. She discovered that George's massive penthouse was designed like his personality, all carefully segregated, spaces and invisible barriers. Their wings connected only through the main living area, a neutral zone where they occasionally crossed paths like wary cats sharing territory. When she emerged, George was waiting by the elevator, his reflection multiplied in the steel doors. The sight of him still had the power to steal her breath, not because of his obvious good looks, but because of the sheer force of his presence. Tonight, in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean strength, he looked like something carved from marble and steel. "You're late," he said without turning. "I'm exactly on time." Megan moved to stand beside him, close enough to catch the subtle scent of his cologne. "And you're nervous." That got his attention. Dark eyes swept over her, assessing. "I don't get nervous." "Your left hand." She nodded toward where his fingers were drumming an irregular pattern against his thigh. "You've been doing that for the past 3 days. Whenever someone mentions tonight's gala." The drumming stopped abruptly. The Winters Foundation Gala is the social event of the season. Half of Boston's business elite will be there watching. Us, waiting for any sign that this marriage is exactly what they suspect, a convenient arrangement. Then we'll have to be very convincing. Megan reached up, straightening his bow tie with steady fingers. It was already perfect, of course, but the gesture felt important somehow. Intimate. "I did community theater in college. I know how to play a role." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or appreciation. "This isn't a college production, Megan. These people are sharks. They'll analyze every gesture, every word." "I know." She met his gaze directly. "That's why we're going to give them exactly what they expect. Boston's most eligible bachelor, finally tamed by love. The cold-hearted CEO who melts only for his new bride. It's practically a fairy tale. You've thought about this." "I've had nothing but time to think." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and they stepped in together. "You're not the only one with something to protect." The ride down was silent, but Megan could feel George watching her in the mirrored walls. When they reached the lobby, he offered his arm with practiced grace. "Ready?" "Almost." Standing on tiptoe, she pressed a soft kiss to the corner of his mouth, leaving the faintest trace of lipstick. His entire body tensed at the contact. "There, now we look like a couple who couldn't quite wait for the car ride." For a moment, she thought she saw a crack in his perfect composure, a flash of something hot and dangerous in his eyes. But then they were moving through the lobby, and George was every inch the polished businessman again. The gala was being held at the historic Bradford Hotel, its gilded ballroom transformed into a glittering wonderland of crystal and candlelight. As they made their entrance, Megan felt the subtle shift in the room's energy. The pause in conversations, the turning heads, the assessing gazes. "Quite an entrance, Mrs. Blackwood." The voice belonged to Regina Winters herself, the Foundation's elegant matriarch. "I must say, we were all surprised by the suddenness of your marriage. When you know, you know." Megan leaned into George's side, feeling the warmth of him through his jacket. "Though I did make him work for it." George's arm slipped around her waist, pulling her closer. "She turned me down twice before agreeing to dinner," he said, and Megan had to admire how smoothly he picked up the lie. "I'm not used to hearing no, which is exactly why you needed to hear it." Megan smiled up at him, letting genuine amusement shine through. They'd never discussed their cover story, but somehow they were building it together, like a dance where both partners instinctively knew the steps. Regina's eyes sparkled with interest. "Oh, you must tell me more. George has always been so focused on business. We were beginning to think he'd never find someone who could match him. Actually, we met at—" George began, but Megan cut him off with a light laugh. "Oh no, darling, you always tell it wrong." She turned to Regina with a conspiratorial smile. "He likes to say we met at a charity auction, but really, he nearly ran me over with his car outside my favorite bookstore. He was so horrified, he insisted on buying me coffee to apologize." George's fingers tightened slightly on her waist. Warning or appreciation, she couldn't tell. "You were reading while walking," he added smoothly. "Complete disregard for personal safety. Jane Austen waits for no man." Megan shrugged, and Regina laughed delightedly. "How perfectly romantic. And now look at you both, the talk of Boston society." Regina patted Megan's arm. "You must join us for the Foundation's board meeting next week. We're always looking for fresh perspectives." As Regina drifted away to greet other guests, George led Megan onto the dance floor. "Jane Austen," he murmured, drawing her into a perfect waltz hold. "Would you have preferred Dostoevsky?" His hand was warm against her back, his movements precise as he guided her through the steps. "Besides, it worked. Regina Winters is practically ready to adopt me. You're better at this than I expected." It wasn't quite a compliment, but something in his voice had softened. "Disappointed?" Megan asked as he turned her under the crystal chandeliers. "Did you think you'd have to teach me everything?" On the contrary. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. "I'm beginning to think you might be dangerous." The music swelled around them, and Megan felt an unexpected thrill run down her spine. "Now that," she said softly, "might be the first honest thing you've said to me all night." They danced in silence after that, moving together with a grace that felt too natural to be entirely pretend. And if Megan's heart beat a little faster when George's thumb traced small circles on her back, well, that was just part of the performance, wasn't it? The children's hospital was quiet at this hour, most of its young patients already asleep. Megan sat alone in the reading room, surrounded by scattered picture books and the remnants of that afternoon's art therapy session. But it wasn't children's drawings that held her attention now. It was the stack of financial documents spread across the table before her. "I thought I might find you here." Megan's head snapped up. George stood in the doorway, his suit jacket draped over one arm, tie loosened just enough to suggest the lateness of the hour. She hadn't heard him approach, which seemed impossible given the hospital's echoing corridors. "How did you know where to look?" He stepped into the room, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller. "You're predictable, Megan. Every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork, except today you missed our dinner with the Anderson group." Megan's stomach dropped. The business dinner, she'd completely forgotten in her excitement over finally finding a lead in Victoria's paper trail. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time." "Lost track of time?" George's voice was dangerously quiet as he approached the table. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Andersons are crucial to our West Coast expansion. Their CEO flew in specifically to meet my new wife, the woman who supposedly changed me for the better." His eyes fell to the scattered papers. "Instead, I find you here, playing detective with confidential company documents. These aren't your company's documents." Megan began gathering the papers, but George was faster. He snatched up a file, scanning its contents with growing tension in his jaw. These are internal transfer records from Carlton Industries. He looked at her sharply. How did you get these? I have my sources. Megan lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. And Carlton Industries was my father's company before Victoria sank her claws into it. Your sources? George's laugh held no humor. You mean Benjamin Wright, my head of accounting? Did you think I wouldn't notice him accessing sealed files? Ben was my father's friend. He's been helping me. He's been fired. George's words fell like stones between them. Along with anyone else who helped you access restricted information. Megan stood so quickly her chair toppled backward. You had no right. Those people have families, mortgages. I had every right. George stepped closer, towering over her. The moment you became Mrs. Blackwood, your little vendetta against Victoria became my problem. Did you even consider how it would look if someone discovered my wife investigating one of our subsidiary companies? Subsidiary? Megan felt the blood drain from her face. Carlton Industries is owned by Blackwood now. Something flickered in George's eyes, regret, perhaps, or guilt. The acquisition was finalized last week. And you didn't think to tell me? Megan's voice cracked. My father's company, everything he built, and you just absorbed it. It was a business decision. It was my heritage, the words echoed off the cheerfully painted walls. That company was supposed to be my legacy, not another trophy in your corporate collection. George reached for her, but Megan stepped back, bumping into the scattered children's books. One fell open, its pages showing a princess locked in a tower. The irony wasn't lost on her. Megan, his voice had softened slightly. I know you want justice for what Victoria did to your father, but there are proper channels, legal processes. Legal processes. Megan gave a bitter laugh. Like the ones that let Victoria forge my father's signature on loan documents, or the ones that let her empty his accounts while he was dying. She snatched up her father's compass from the table, clutching it like a shield. The law doesn't help people like me against people like her. I thought you, of all people, would understand that. What's that supposed to mean? I've done my research, George. I know what happened with your first wife. She saw the shock register on his face, quickly masked by anger. How she and your former business partner nearly destroyed everything you'd built. How you had to operate outside the law to protect your empire. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You've been investigating me. Know your enemy, isn't that what you always say? Megan gathered the remaining documents, with trembling hands. I needed to understand who I was really dealing with. Enemy? George caught her arm as she tried to pass him. Is that what you think I am? The heat of his hand burned through her sleeve, and Megan forced herself to meet his gaze. I think you're exactly what you claim to be, a businessman protecting his interests, and right now I'm a liability to those interests. You're my wife. I'm a contract. Megan pulled free of his grip. And contracts can be broken. She was almost to the door when his voice stopped her. The files you're looking for, the ones that would prove Victoria's embezzlement, they're not in Carlton's records. Megan turned slowly. What? Victoria was smarter than that. She used a shell company to funnel the money. George straightened his tie, his CEO mask sliding back into place. A company that, coincidentally, was acquired by Blackwood Industries 3 days ago. Understanding dawned. You've been investigating her too. Unlike you, I have the resources to do it properly. He picked up his jacket, brushing off invisible lint. The evidence you need will be on my desk tomorrow morning. Do try not to be late this time. Megan stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew about George Blackwood. Why? Why help me now? He paused at the door, and for a moment she glimpsed something raw and honest in his expression. "Because you're not the only one who knows how it feels to be betrayed by family." His eyes met hers. "7 o'clock, my office. Don't make me regret this, Megan." After he left, Megan sank into a chair, her father's compass cool against her. Umpalm, the princess in the fallen storybook, still gazed out from her tower, but now Megan wondered, was her prince really a dragon in disguise, or was the dragon merely wearing armor to protect old wounds? Tomorrow she would find out. Tomorrow she would finally have the means to destroy Victoria. But as Megan gathered her things in the quiet hospital room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial about George Blackwood. Something that might change everything she thought she knew about their carefully constructed arrangement. At precisely 7 o'clock, Megan stood in George's office, watching dawn paint the Boston skyline in shades of rose and gold. She hadn't slept. Couldn't sleep, really, with last night's revelations churning in her mind. The evidence against Victoria was spread across George's desk. Bank statements, forged signatures, wire transfers that painted a damning picture of calculated theft. She was thorough. George's voice came from behind her. "I'll give her that." Megan didn't turn. "How long have you known?" "About Victoria's embezzlement? Since before our marriage." His footsteps were quiet on the thick carpet as he moved to stand beside her. "About her connection to my ex-wife's family that I discovered 2 weeks ago." Now Megan did turn, shock temporarily overwhelming her lingering anger. "What?" George's expression was grim as he handed her a coffee, prepared exactly as she liked it, she noticed absently. "Victoria's maiden name is Reynolds, as in Reynolds Banking Group, as in the same family that helped my ex-wife nearly destroy everything I built. That's not possible." But even as Megan said it, pieces began falling into place. The timing of her marriage to my father was approximately 6 months after my divorce was finalized. George leaned against his desk, his usual perfect posture, relaxed slightly. "At first I thought it was coincidence, but Victoria's systematic destruction of Carlton Industries follows the exact same pattern they tried to use against me." Megan sank into one of the leather chairs, her mind racing. "So, when Victoria approached you about our marriage, I saw an opportunity." George's eyes met hers over the rim of his coffee cup. "To protect Carlton Industries, to keep an eye on Victoria, and to finally unravel whatever game the Reynolds family is playing. And I was just a convenient pawn." The words tasted bitter. "At first." Something shifted in his expression. "But you've proven to be far more interesting than I anticipated." Heat crept up Megan's neck at his tone. "Is that why you fired Ben? To protect your game?" "I fired Ben because he was feeding information to Victoria." George set down his cup with precise movements. "He's been her spy for months. Those files he gave you, they were carefully selected to lead you down the wrong path." The betrayal hit Megan like a physical blow. Ben, who had bounced her on his knee as a child, who had helped her father build Carlton Industries from nothing. "I trusted him." "Trust is a luxury we can't afford right now." George's voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Victoria knows you're investigating her. She's already making moves to neutralize you." "What kind of moves?" Instead of answering, George reached for a remote control. The office's massive screen came to life, showing security camera footage of Victoria entering an upscale restaurant. The timestamp showed yesterday afternoon, right when Megan should have been at the Anderson dinner. "She's meeting with Richard Anderson," George explained, "trying to convince him that our marriage is a sham, that you're unstable, that I'm only using you to cover up financial irregularities at Carlton Industries. That's why you were so angry about me missing dinner." Megan watched Victoria laugh at something Anderson said, her perfectly manicured hand touching his arm. "She's trying to destroy your deal." She's trying to destroy us both. George moved to stand behind Megan's chair, his presence like a wall of heat against her back. The West Coast expansion would give Blackwood Industries enough leverage to fully expose the Reynolds family's illegal activities. Victoria can't let that happen. Megan twisted to look up at him. So, what do? We give her exactly what she wants. A smile curved George's lips, dangerous and somehow thrilling, a very public scandal. I don't understand. Victoria expects us to play defense, to present a perfect united front while she chips away at our credibility. His hand came to rest on the back of her chair, fingers brushing her shoulder. Instead, we're going to have a very visible fight. You'll storm out, I'll drink too much at a business dinner, and Victoria will think her plan is working, while we're actually following the money. George leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. I've already traced most of it through her shell companies. We just need access to her private records to complete the picture. Megan suppressed a shiver at his proximity. And how do we get those? There's a charity auction at her house next week. The perfect opportunity for a distraught wife to get lost looking for the powder room. His voice held a note of admiration. You're good at playing roles, aren't you, Megan? She thought of their performance at the gala, of how naturally they'd fallen into step with each other. I can be very convincing when motivated. Good. His hand moved from the chair to her shoulder, and this time Megan couldn't suppress her shiver. Because for this to work, we need to trust each other completely. No more separate investigations, no more hidden agendas. Are we clear? Megan stood, turning to face him fully. This close, she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, smell the expensive cologne that had become oddly familiar. Crystal clear, but George... She let her hand rest on his chest, feeling his heart rate quicken. If you're playing me too, I'll destroy you just as thoroughly as we're going to destroy Victoria. For a moment, something hot and electric crackled between them. Then George caught her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Noted, Mrs. Blackwood. He pressed a kiss to her palm, a gesture that felt more intimate than any of their public displays. Shall we begin? Megan withdrew her hand slowly, trying to ignore how her skin tingled where he'd touched it. One condition. When this is over, Carlton Industries returns to my control. Already done. At her surprised look, he smiled slightly. The paperwork is being drawn up. Consider it a wedding present. As Megan left his office that morning, her mind spinning with plans and possibilities, she couldn't help but wonder, was this alliance with George more dangerous than being his enemy had been? And why did the thought of working closely with him send such a delicious thrill down her spine? The game was changing, the players repositioning. But as she touched her palm where George's lips had been, Megan realized that somewhere along the way, the rules had changed too. She just wasn't sure either of them knew what they were playing for anymore. You're suffocating me! Megan's voice carried across Le Petit Bistro's intimate dining room, causing heads to turn and conversations to falter. She stood with both hands pressed against the white tablecloth, crystal glasses trembling from the force of her movement. George remained seated, his face a mask of controlled irritation that would have seemed genuine to anyone who didn't know better. Lower your voice, he commanded, exactly as they'd rehearsed. You're making a scene. A scene? Megan gave a bitter laugh that surprised even herself with its authenticity. Heaven forbid the perfect George Blackwood have to deal with anything messy or real. Is that why you bought yourself a wife instead of actually dating someone? Because real relationships are too inconvenient? Something flickered in George's eyes, a brief crack in his performance that made Megan's heart stutter. This wasn't in their script. Careful, Megan. His voice dropped dangerously low. You're crossing a line. No, you crossed it first, when you decided to control every aspect of my life. She grabbed her wine glass, the red liquid sloshing dangerously. My clothes, my schedule, my friends. Did you really think I wouldn't notice that you had Lucy fired from the hospital volunteer program? George's jaw tightened, and Megan realized she'd hit upon something true. He had interfered with her hospital work, though they'd never discussed it. The real anger that flooded her veins made her next words sharp as blades. You're exactly what everyone said you were. A cold, controlling bastard who thinks everything and everyone can be bought and managed. Well, guess what? I'm not one of your acquisitions, George. I'm not something you can just add to your portfolio. She threw the wine in his face. They hadn't planned this part. It was pure impulse, born from the strange mix of real and pretend emotions churning inside her. Red liquid dripped down his perfectly pressed shirt, and for a moment genuine shock registered on his features. Megan. Her name was half warning, half something else entirely. Sit down. Or what? You'll fire me too. She grabbed her purse, aware of phones recording their drama for tomorrow's society pages. I'd rather be penniless than spend another minute pretending to be happy in this sham of a marriage. She stormed out of the restaurant, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a satisfyingly dramatic exit. The cool night air hit her flushed face as she emerged onto the sidewalk, and she forced herself to maintain her angry stride until she reached the waiting car around the corner. The driver, one of George's most trusted security personnel, opened the door without a word. Megan slid into the back seat, her hands shaking as adrenaline coursed through her system. That had been intense, more intense than she'd expected. Some of those words had come from somewhere real, somewhere raw and honest that she hadn't meant to expose. Her phone buzzed with a text from George. Nicely done. Though the wine was an unexpected touch. Megan typed back, had to make it convincing. Sorry about your shirt. 3 dots appeared as he typed, disappeared, then appeared again. It was effective. Victoria's already calling her contacts. Meet me at home in an hour. We need to discuss Phase 2. Home. When had she started thinking of his penthouse as home? Megan leaned back against the leather seat, closing her eyes as the city lights blurred past the window. The script they'd prepared had been carefully crafted to hint at trouble in paradise without revealing their true plan. But something had shifted during their performance. Lines meant to be artificial had struck too close to truth. An hour later she stood in George's private study, having changed from her designer dress into comfortable loungewear. He entered without knocking, his ruined shirt replaced with a casual black sweater that made him look somehow more approachable. Victoria took the bait, he announced without preamble. She's already reached out to 3 board members, suggesting an emergency meeting about the company's leadership. Good. Megan poured them both a drink from his private collection. She'd learned his preference for aged scotch. Though I'm sorry about getting so carried away. George accepted the glass, his fingers brushing hers. You weren't entirely wrong. About what? Lucy. He took a slow sip, not meeting her eyes. I did have her transferred to a different department. Her father works for Carlton Industries. It was too risky. You could have told me. Would you have understood? Now he did look at her, his gaze intense. Or would you have accused me of being controlling then too? Megan set down her untouched drink. Is that what this is about? You think I meant those things I said? Didn't you? At least part of you. He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. You're not wrong, Megan. I am controlling. I do try to manage every variable, every risk. It's how I've survived. I know. And she did know, now that she understood about his ex-wife's betrayal. But you can't control everything, George. You can't control... She gestured vaguely between them, not sure how to name this tension that kept building. Us? His voice was rough. Is that what you were going to say? The air felt thick with unspoken things. Megan was acutely aware of how alone they were, how the city lights painted shadows across his features, softening his usual sharp edges. "We should focus on the plan," she said quietly. "Victoria will expect us to be apart tonight, so I should go to my wing." "Of course." George stepped back, professional mask sliding back into place. "The auction is in 3 days. We'll need to maintain our distance publicly until then." Megan moved toward the door, but his voice stopped her. "That thing you said at the restaurant, about pretending to be happy." He paused, and she held her breath. "Were you pretending?" She turned back, studying the man who had become so much more complicated than the cold businessman she'd first met. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "Are you?" But George didn't answer, and Megan didn't wait for him to try. She fled to her wing of the penthouse, her heart pounding with the realization that their carefully constructed act was becoming something dangerously real. In her room, she found a small package on her bed, a replacement for the silver compass she'd apparently dropped during their staged fight. The note attached read simply, "Some things are worth protecting." Megan traced her fingers over George's bold handwriting, wondering when exactly their game of pretend had started to feel like the most real thing in her life. Victoria Carter's mansion blazed with light, every window a gleaming rectangle in the autumn darkness. Megan sat in the back of George's Bentley, watching guests in evening wear ascend the stone steps like actors taking their places on stage. Somewhere in that house were the documents they needed, proof of Victoria's connections to the Reynolds family and their systematic destruction of Carlton Industries. "Your hands are shaking." George's voice was low beside her. "Just playing." "My part?" Megan smoothed invisible wrinkles from her red dress, a deliberate choice, the color of war and warning. The jilted wife drowning her sorrows at her stepmother's charity auction. "I'm supposed to be nervous." "Megan!" His hand covered hers, stilling their trembling. "We don't have to do this tonight. We can find another way." She turned to look at him, struck by the concern in his usually guarded expression. In the 3 days since their stage fight, they'd maintained their public separation, communicating only through encrypted messages and brief meetings in his office. But something had shifted between them, a new awareness that made even casual touches feel charged with meaning. "I need to do this," she said firmly. "Victoria's office will never be this accessible again. Besides," she managed a small smile, "I've always wanted to play spy. This isn't a game." His fingers tightened on hers. "If she catches you, she won't." Megan squeezed his hand once before pulling away. "You taught me well, remember? Every variable controlled, every risk managed." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Except you've never been very good at following my plans. Then it's a good thing you'll be watching my back." She reached for the door handle, but George caught her arm. "Wait!" He pulled something from his jacket, a delicate diamond bracelet that caught the light like captured stars. "You'll need this." "George?" Megan's breath caught as he fastened it around her wrist. "It's beautiful. It's also a tracker." His fingers lingered on her pulse point. "If anything goes wrong, if you feel threatened at all, press the largest stone. 3 times I'll find you." The tenderness of the gesture made her throat tight. "My very own knight in Armani armor. More like a dragon guarding his treasure." The words were light, but his eyes were intense. "Be careful in there, Megan. Victoria's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." She nodded once, then stepped out into the cool evening air. As planned, she arrived separate from George, playing into the rumors of their marital troubles. Victoria's smirk when she greeted Megan at the door was almost worth the humiliation of the gossip. "Darling," Victoria air-kissed her cheek, her perfume overwhelming. "How brave of you to come." Though I suppose you couldn't stay hidden in that mausoleum of a penthouse forever. I never hide. Megan accepted a champagne flute from a passing waiter. Besides, I'm still a Carter. This is my legacy too. Oh, sweetheart. Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. You stopped being a Carter the moment you sold yourself to George Blackwood. Now you're just another of his acquisitions, and not even one he particularly wants to keep. The words were meant to hurt, but Megan let them slide off like water. She knew her role tonight. The wounded wife, drinking too much, making slightly inappropriate comments. It would give her the perfect excuse to get lost, looking for a bathroom later. The auction items were displayed throughout the first floor. Art jewelry, vacation packages donated by Boston's elite. Megan wandered among them, playing her part while monitoring the security guards' patterns. George arrived fashionably late, perfectly disheveled in a way that suggested recent drinking. He ignored her completely, which somehow hurt despite being exactly as planned. Trouble in paradise? A familiar voice made her stiffen. Richard Anderson stood beside her, studying a painting with practiced nonchalance. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Megan sipped her champagne, watching George chat with a group of investors across the room. No. Anderson's voice dripped false sympathy. That's not what Victoria tells me. Something about control issues, trust problems, and of course, there was that scene at Le Petit Bistrot. You shouldn't believe everything you hear, Mr. Anderson. Please call me Richard. He touched her elbow lightly. You know, if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands what it's like to be caught in George Blackwood's web. A burst of laughter drew their attention. George stood, with Victoria now, his hand resting casually on her back as she smiled up at him. The sight sent an unexpected surge of jealousy through Megan's chest. Excuse me. She set down her glass with shaking hands. I need some air. She climbed the main staircase, feeling Anderson's eyes on her back. This wasn't part of the plan. She was supposed to wait another hour before making her move. But the image of George and Victoria together had unbalanced her in a way she hadn't expected. Victoria's office was at the end of the upstairs hall, protected by a keypad lock. Megan pulled a compact from her clutch, checking her reflection. While actually studying the keypad, makeup powder revealed the most commonly pressed numbers, just as George had taught her. The lock clicked open on her second try. The office was exactly as George's intelligence had suggested. Modern, minimalist, with a wall of filing cabinets behind an imposing desk. Megan went straight to the hidden safe behind a terrible modern art piece, her fingers trembling slightly, as she input the combination they'd obtained from Victoria's former assistant. Looking for something? Megan's heart stopped. Victoria stood in the doorway, elegant and lethal in black designer wear, and beside her, looking equally dangerous in his perfectly tailored suit, was George. I can explain, Megan started, but Victoria's laugh cut her off. Oh, I'm sure you can. The question is... Victoria's smile was triumphant as she closed the door. Can he? Megan looked at George, waiting for some sign that this was part of their plan, some indication that he hadn't just betrayed her to their enemy. But his face was a mask she couldn't read, and the diamond bracelet on her wrist suddenly felt like it was burning her skin. The game had changed again. She just wasn't sure if she was still a player or if she'd become just another piece on someone else's board. The silence in Victoria's office stretched like a wire about to snap. Megan's fingers brushed the diamond bracelet, wondering if she should trigger the alarm, but what was the point if George was already here, standing beside her enemy? I have to admit, Victoria moved to her desk with casual grace. You played your parts beautifully. The public fight, the separation, the wounded wife seeking comfort from Richard Anderson. She smiled at George. We almost believed it. Almost? Megan's voice was steady despite her racing heart. Oh, darling. Victoria's laugh was silk over steel. Did you really think you were the only one who could act? That George would really... Leave his wife wandering around my house unsupervised. She gestured to George. Show her. George stepped forward, and for the first time, Megan noticed something odd in his movements. A slight stiffness, a careful precision that seemed wrong. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a USB drive. Everything you need is here, he said, but his voice was pitched slightly too loud. Bank records, shell companies, the entire Reynolds connection. Victoria's smile widened. You see, George has been working with me all along. The marriage, the investigation, it was all designed to flush out the real conspiracy. She turned to Megan with false sympathy. Your father wasn't just embezzling from his own company, dear. He was helping the Reynolds family hide money for years. No, Megan shook her head. You're lying. Am I? Victoria opened a drawer, removing a thick file. These are copies of transfers your father authorized. Millions of dollars moving through Carlton Industries to offshore accounts. Your precious daddy was a criminal, Megan, and now his daughter is caught breaking and entering. She smiled coldly. I wonder what the board will think when they learn their CEO's wife is facing criminal charges. Megan's mind raced. Something wasn't right. George's posture, his too loud voice, the way he hadn't quite looked at her since entering the room. The bracelet suddenly felt warm against her skin, and understanding clicked into place. 3. Quick presses, he'd said, a signal for help, but he was already here, unless... You're right, Megan said slowly, letting defeat color her tone. I should have known better than to trust a Blackwood. She moved toward the desk, shoulders slumped. At least show me the proof. I deserve that much. Victoria's triumph made her careless. She spread the documents across her desk, eager to twist. The knife. See? Your father's signature on every transfer, dating back 5 years all the way until 3 months before his death, Megan finished, when he was already in the hospital, unable to hold a pen. Victoria's smile faltered. What? The signatures. Megan touched one of the papers. They're perfect copies of his healthy signature, but my father had nerve damage from the chemotherapy. His handwriting changed completely in his last year. She looked up at Victoria. You didn't know that, did you? Because you never actually saw him sign anything. It doesn't matter. Victoria's voice sharpened. Your word against these records, and with George's testimony about that. The new voice came from the doorway, where another George Blackwood stood, this one moving with the fluid grace Megan knew so well. I'm afraid my brother's testimony won't hold up in court. Victoria whirled, her face draining of color as she looked between the two identical men. Robert? The George beside her, Robert, gave a slight bow. Hello, Victoria. Sorry about the deception, but when my brother called in a favor, you were always the better actor, the real George said, entering the room with predatory grace. Though next time, try to remember I had my shoulder reconstructed last year. The stiffness was a bit obvious. Megan's knees felt weak with relief. You knew she'd try something like this. I knew she'd try to turn us against each other. George moved to stand beside her, his hand settling possessively on her lower back. Victoria's preferred weapon has always been doubt. Isn't that right, Victoria? Victoria's composed mask was cracking. You can't prove anything. Actually, we can. Robert pulled out his phone, showing a recording app. Your entire confession about forging Richard Carter's signatures is saved for posterity, and the real documents, he nodded to the safe Megan, had been about to open, still exactly where you left them. You were recording the whole time. Victoria's eyes narrowed at Megan. You played me. I learned from the best. Megan smiled coldly. You taught me how to wear a mask, Victoria. How to smile while plotting someone's destruction. I just found a better reason to use those skills. Victoria lunged for her desk drawer, but George was faster. He caught her wrist before she could reach whatever weapon she'd hidden there. It's Over, he said quietly. The FBI is already downstairs. Agent Phillips sends his regards. Apparently they've been building a case against the Reynolds family for years. You just helped provide the final piece. You'll never prove it was all me, Victoria spat. Richard Anderson, the Reynolds connection, already taken care of. Robert grinned. Why do you think I've been playing my brother at all those business meetings? The real George has been gathering evidence for weeks, while everyone thought he was destroying his marriage. Megan turned to George in surprise. The Anderson dinner I missed was with Robert, not me. His eyes held apology and something warmer. I was actually meeting with the FBI that night. I couldn't tell you. We needed your reactions to be genuine. You could have trusted me, Megan said softly. I do trust you. His hand tightened on her waist. But I needed Victoria to believe she could drive us apart. Your anger that night at the restaurant, it had to be real. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. Agent Phillips entered with 2 other FBI agents, their badges glinting in the overhead lights. Victoria Carter, Phillips began, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement and conspiracy. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, her designer dress clashing with the steel bracelets around her wrists, Megan felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. Her father's name would be cleared, Carlton Industries would be saved, and George. She turned to thank Robert, but he had quietly slipped away, leaving her alone with his brother. I'm sorry, George said before she could speak, for not telling you everything, for letting you think even for a moment that I had betrayed you. Did you mean any of it? Megan asked, needing to know. These past weeks, working together, growing closer. Was that all part of the plan too? George reached up, cupping her face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his powerful persona. That was the one variable I couldn't control, he admitted. The one risk I hadn't planned for. What risk? Falling in love with my wife. The words hung between them, real and raw and unexpected. Megan's heart thundered in her chest as George continued, his usual composure stripped away. I thought I could keep my distance, play my part without getting involved. But you... He shook his head, smiling slightly. You challenged everything I thought I knew, every wall I built, every rule I made about keeping business and emotions separate. You walked right through them all. George, Megan started, but he pressed a finger to her lips. Let me finish. When I married you, I thought I was just protecting my interests, solving a problem. I didn't expect you to be brilliant and fierce and impossible to ignore. I didn't expect to wake up every morning wanting to make you smile, to earn your trust, to be worthy of the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Megan's vision blurred with tears. And here, I thought I was the only one acting. No more acting. George's forehead rested against hers. No more games or pretense, just us figuring out what this is between us, if that's what you want. Instead of answering, Megan stretched up on her toes and kissed him. This wasn't like their staged kisses for the public. This was real and deep and full of everything they'd been holding back. George's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer as if he'd never let go. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Megan touched the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Does this mean I get to keep the tracker? George laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Keep it all, the bracelet, the company, my heart. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Next time we need to set a trap for a criminal mastermind. His eyes sparkled with mischief. Let's skip the part where you throw wine in my face. Megan grinned up at him, feeling for the first time like she was exactly where she belonged. I don't know. That was one of my better performances. Trust me, George murmured, pulling her in for another kiss. Reality is much more interesting. And as the sounds of the charity auction continued below, as Victoria was led away to face justice, as their carefully constructed plan finally bore fruit, Megan realized that sometimes the best endings weren't the ones you planned for. They were the ones that surprised you, challenged you, and ultimately changed you for the better. The morning headlines screamed across every major newspaper in Boston. Society scandal, Victoria Carter arrested at charity auction, Reynolds banking conspiracy exposed, Blackwood power couple unveils elaborate sting operation. Meghan sat in the breakfast nook of the penthouse, surrounded by papers and half-drunk coffee, while George paced behind her taking calls. The autumn sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, making the diamond bracelet on her wrist scatter light across the morning papers. "No comment," George said firmly into his phone. "My wife and I will release a statement through proper channels." A pause. "No, Robert won't be available for interviews either." Meghan smiled into her coffee. The revelation of George's identical twin had sent the media into a frenzy. Everyone wanted to know how Boston's elite had been fooled, how many times Robert had stood in for his brother, whether there were other secrets the Blackwood family kept hidden. "They're calling us Bonnie and Clyde," she said as George ended his call, "though I think that comparison rather misses the point. They're calling us a lot of things." George dropped into the chair beside her, looking unusually rumpled in just his dress shirt and slacks. "The board wants an emergency meeting this afternoon." "Are they angry?" "On the contrary." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Our stock price is up 12%. Apparently the public loves the idea of a power couple working together to expose corruption." "Is that what we are?" Meghan turned to face him fully. "A power couple?" George's eyes softened. "We're whatever you want us to be. The contract is void now. You're free to walk away." Instead of answering, Meghan rose and moved to the kitchen counter. She returned with 2 small items: her father's compass and the marriage contract, now wrinkled and coffee-stained from weeks of being carried in her purse. "The compass was never just about direction," she said, placing it between them. "It was about remembering who I am, where I came from. Every time I felt lost these past weeks, it reminded me that my father believed in doing what's right, no matter the cost." George watched her carefully. "And now?" "Now I know that sometimes the right path isn't the one you planned." She picked up the contract. "This started as a business arrangement, a way for you to protect your interests and me to save my father's legacy, but somewhere along the way—" "It became real," George finished softly. "Did it?" Meghan met his gaze. "Because I need to know, George. No more games, no more strategic omissions. Are we real?" George was silent for a long moment, and Meghan's heart thundered in her chest. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I bought this the morning after our fight. At Le Petit Bistrot," he said, opening it to reveal a stunning emerald ring. "Not for show, not for our plan. Just because I couldn't stop thinking about how you looked in the moonlight that night, angry and beautiful, and more real than anything in my carefully controlled world." Meghan's breath caught. "George, I've spent my whole life planning for every contingency, protecting myself from any possibility of betrayal." His voice was rough with emotion. "But you made me want to risk everything, to be vulnerable, to trust not just with my mind, but with my heart." He placed the ring beside her compass. "I'm not asking you to wear it. We can date properly, court each other like we should have from the beginning, but I want you to have it as a promise that whatever we become, it will be real. No more contracts, no more pretending." Meghan picked up the ring, admiring how the emerald matched her eyes. "You know, most couples date first, then get married. When have we ever done anything the conventional way?" A smile tugged at his lips. "True." She slid the ring onto her finger, where it sat perfectly beside her wedding band. "Though I do have some conditions for this new arrangement." George's eyebrow rose. "Such as?" First, no more secret twin switch-outs without telling. Me, I don't care if it's for business or national security. I need to know who I'm kissing. Agreed, he chuckled. Though for the record, Robert was never allowed to kiss you. Second, Megan continued, we make decisions together about the companies, about our public life, about everything. I'm not just arm candy or a silent partner. You were never either of those things. George pulled her onto his lap, his arms wrapping around her waist. You're my equal in every way, smarter than me in most. And third, Megan traced her fingers along his jaw. We keep the tracking bracelet. It might come in handy for other activities. George's eyes darkened. What kind of activities? Well, she leaned closer, her lips brushing his ear. I was thinking we could start with you trying to find me in this very large penthouse. She was off his lap and running before he could react, her laughter echoing through the halls. George gave her a 10-second head start before following, his own deep laughter joining hers. Hours later, they lay tangled in the sheets of his bed, their bed now, watching the sun set over the Boston skyline. The newspapers lay forgotten in the breakfast nook. The phones had been silenced, and the world outside could wait. You never answered my question, George murmured, playing with her fingers where they rested on his chest. Are you staying? Megan propped herself up on an elbow, studying the man who had begun as her adversary and become so much more. I'm staying, she said softly, not because of a contract or a plan or even this beautiful ring. I'm staying because somewhere between all the lies and schemes and pretense, I fell in love with the real George Blackwood. And who is he? George's voice held genuine curiosity. He's brilliant and controlling and frustratingly overprotective, she smiled as he winced, but he's also kind and passionate and capable of more love than he gives himself credit for. He's the man who replaced my father's compass when he thought I'd lost it. The man who learns children's names at the hospital just so he can ask about them when I come home. The man who looks at me like I'm the most fascinating puzzle he's ever encountered. George pulled her down for a kiss that left them both breathless. I love you, he whispered against her lips. No strategy, no ulterior motive, just truth. Outside their window, camera flashes occasionally lit up the darkening sky, reporters still hoping for a glimpse of Boston's new favorite couple. But inside, in the warm cocoon of their bedroom, Megan and George were finally writing their own story, one where business and pleasure, truth and trust, love and ambition all blended into something uniquely theirs. And if anyone doubted the authenticity of their feelings now, well, they had a lifetime to prove that sometimes the best business decision was following your heart. They're trying to force a hostile takeover. George's voice was tight with controlled anger as he stared at the screens covering his office wall. Each display showed a different financial chart, all trending downward. The Reynolds family is calling in every favor, leveraging every connection they have. Megan studied the data, her mind racing. 2 weeks after Victoria's arrest, the Reynolds family had finally shown their hand, and it was more devastating than they'd anticipated. Someone was systematically attacking both Blackwood Industries and the newly restored Carlton Industries, targeting their weakest points with surgical precision. These attacks are too coordinated, she said, moving closer to examine a particularly concerning graph. They know exactly where to hit us, almost as if they had inside information. George's jaw clenched. Victoria may be in custody, but she had years to plant loyal people throughout both companies. We need to identify the moles before... Megan's words were cut off by George's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Robert's name. Tell me you have. Good news, George answered on speaker. Define good. Robert's voice was grim. I just got out of a meeting with the Shanghai board. Someone convinced them that the FBI investigation might extend to our Asian operations. They're talking about pulling out of the merger. George slammed his hand on the desk. That merger represents 30% of our projected growth for next year. Without it, our stock becomes vulnerable, Megan finished. They could force a shareholder vote. It gets worse. Robert paused. Elizabeth Reynolds was seen having lunch with Christina Porter yesterday. The color drained from George's face. Christina, are you sure? Megan touched his arm. Who's Christina Porter? My ex-wife's sister. George's voice was carefully neutral. And the head of Porter Investment Group. They control enough shares and to tip the balance in a hostile takeover. Megan felt cold despite the warm office. They're not just attacking our business, they're coming after everything. George began to pace, his usual controlled demeanor cracking. I should have seen this coming. The Reynolds family was never going to let Victoria take the fall alone. They're too connected, too powerful. George. Megan stepped into his path, forcing him to stop. Look at me. We knew they'd retaliate. Now we fight back. This isn't like exposing Victoria. His hands came to rest on her shoulders. These people, they'll destroy everything I've built, everything your father built. I can't let that happen. I can't let them hurt you. Then don't shut me out. Megan covered his hands with hers. We're stronger together, remember? No more lone wolf decisions. Something flickered in his eyes, guilt perhaps, or resignation. Megan, what did you do? George stepped back, moving to his desk. He withdrew an envelope, thick, official-looking, with the familiar law firm's letterhead. This is a transfer of ownership. It puts Carlton Industries entirely in your name, legally separated from Blackwood's assets. Understanding dawned. You're trying to protect me. If they succeed in taking over Blackwood Industries, at least your father's company will be safe. He held out the envelope. You can run it independently, rebuild without... No! Megan's voice was sharp. Megan, be reasonable. Reasonable. She snatched the envelope and tore it in half. Like you were being reasonable when you made this decision without consulting me. We're supposed to be partners, George, in everything. I'm trying to protect you, and I'm trying to protect us. The torn papers fluttered to the floor between them. The Reynolds family thinks they can divide and conquer. Fine, let them try. But I'm not walking away from this fight, and I'm certainly not walking away from you. The intercom buzzed before George could respond. Mr. Blackwood, the board is assembled in the conference room. Megan straightened her spine. We need to tell them everything, about Victoria's people, about Christina Porter, all of it. No more secrets. They'll panic. Maybe. She smoothed his tie, a gesture that had become habit. Or maybe they'll see what I see, a CEO who's finally learned that true strength comes from trust, not control. George caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. When did you become so wise? Around the same time you became so overprotective. She smiled slightly. Now are we facing this together, or do I need to stage another public fight to knock some sense into you? For the first time that morning, genuine amusement crossed his face. No more wine throwing, please. This is my favorite suit. Then, trust me. She laced their fingers together. Trust us. The board meeting was tense, the air heavy with unasked questions. George stood at the head of the table, every inch the powerful CEO, but his hand remained joined with Megan's as he laid out the situation. The Reynolds family is attempting to leverage their connections to force a hostile takeover, he began without preamble. They have inside help, possibly from people Victoria placed in key positions, and yes, they may succeed. Murmurs of alarm rippled through the room. Megan squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. But they've made one critical mistake. George's voice hardened. They assume I'm the same man I was 3 years ago. Isolated, untrusting, vulnerable to manipulation. They don't understand that true strength comes from connection, not isolation. from trust, not control. He looked at Megan, and the love in his eyes made her heart skip. My wife taught me that, and now we're asking for your trust in return. Help us identify the people working against us. Help us prove that Blackwood Industries isn't just one man's empire. It's a family protecting its own. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Arnold Chen, their oldest board member, cleared his throat. Christina Porter approached me last week, suggested I might want to reconsider my position if certain changes in leadership occurred. Others began speaking up, reporting suspicious contacts, questionable decisions, subtle pressures they'd noticed but hadn't understood until now. Each revelation was another piece of the puzzle, another thread in the web the Reynolds family had woven. As the meeting continued, strategies forming and loyalty solidifying, Megan watched her husband transform. The weight of secrets lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the strength of shared purpose. He wasn't just George Blackwood, the untouchable CEO anymore. He was a leader earning his people's trust, a husband learning to share his burdens, a man finally understanding that vulnerability could be its own kind of power. Later, alone in his office, Megan pulled up the latest stock reports. The numbers were still red, the danger far from over. But something had shifted today. In the company, in their marriage, in George himself. The Shanghai board called back, he said, joining her at the screens. They want to meet with us, both of us. Us? Megan raised an eyebrow. I thought you handled all international negotiations personally. I thought I had to handle everything personally. So he wrapped his arms around her from behind. I'm learning to delegate, especially to brilliant women who throw wine in my face when I'm being stubborn. Megan leaned back against his chest, watching their reflection in the darkened windows. The Reynolds family won't know what hit them. No, George agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. They won't. The Shanghai skyline glittered like stars brought to earth, its towers reaching into the night sky. Megan stood at the window of their hotel suite, watching the city pulse with life 40 stories below. Behind her, George was reviewing their strategy one final time with Robert via video call. Elizabeth Reynolds landed an hour ago. Robert's voice crackled through the secure line. She's staying at the Peninsula. And Christina Porter? George asked, his reflection in the window showing the subtle tension in his shoulders. Still, in Boston, trying to convince the remaining board members to support the takeover. But here's the interesting part. She's been making calls to a law firm in the Cayman Islands. Megan turned from the window. The same firm that handled Victoria's offshore accounts. Got it in one. Robert's grin was audible. And guess who else uses that firm? James Chen. George's head snapped up. Arnold Chen's son, who just happens to be the assistant director of Asian operations for the Reynolds banking group. Megan moved to the desk, spreading out the files they'd gathered. The same position he got shortly after his father joined our board. Arnold was their plant all along, George said quietly. That's how they knew about the Shanghai merger before it went public. He played us beautifully, Megan admitted. Coming forward in that board meeting, pretending to expose Christina's approach, it gave him the perfect cover to keep feeding them information. Well, he just made his last move. George's smile was razor-sharp. Robert, is everything in place? Operation Lightning Strike is ready to go, just waiting for your signal, brother. Megan raised an eyebrow at the operation name. Really? Robert named it, George said defensively. The point is, we're ready. The moment Elizabeth Reynolds tries to present her takeover proposal to the Shanghai board tomorrow, every skeleton in her family's closet goes public. Megan touched the emerald ring on her finger, a habit she'd developed when thinking deeply. But won't she expect some kind of counterattack? She'll expect George Blackwood's usual tactics, Robert chimed in. Aggressive stock buybacks, legal challenges, maybe some strategic leaked rumors, but she won't expect us, Megan finished. The combined resources of Blackwood and Carlton Industries, plus everything we learned from Victoria's files. George ended the call with Robert and pulled Megan into his arms. Having second thoughts? About destroying the people who tried. To destroy our families? She shook her head. No, I'm just processing the scale of what we're about to do. We can still back off, he offered. Take Robert's original suggestion, split the companies, protect what we can. Megan silenced him with a kiss. Not a chance. The Reynolds family wanted a war. They're about to learn why you don't attack a dragon in his own lair. Dragon, His eyes darkened with appreciation. I thought I was just your overprotective husband. You're both. She straightened his tie. Tomorrow's meeting would start early. But right now, I need the dragon. The Reynolds family thinks they're facing the same George Blackwood they almost destroyed 3 years ago. Let's show them how wrong they are. Hours later, they walked into the Shanghai boardroom like royalty entering court. George, in a perfectly tailored black suit that screamed power, Megan in a deep green dress that matched her ring and made her eyes flash like jewels. The message was clear. They were a unit, unshakable and unafraid. Elizabeth Reynolds was already there, elegant in cream silk that did nothing to hide the predatory gleam in her eyes. "George," she purred, "how lovely to see you again, and this must be the new Mrs. Blackwood. We've heard so much about your theatrical talents." "Miss Reynolds," Megan's smile was pure steel. "I'd say we've heard a lot about you too, but honestly, you've been rather disappointing so far." Elizabeth's perfectly maintained composure slipped for just a moment. "Excuse me?" "Well, this takeover attempt." Megan gestured dismissively. "It's all very predictable. Using Arnold Chen to spy on us, having Christina play the sympathy card with the board. I expected more creativity from the family that once brought George Blackwood to his knees." George's hand settled on her lower back, a gesture that looked possessive but was actually supportive. They'd planned this provocation carefully. Anger made people sloppy, and they needed Elizabeth Reynolds very, very sloppy. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, little girl." Elizabeth's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Your husband might have caught Victoria, but she was always the weakest link. The real power of the Reynolds family comes from decades of systematic fraud, money laundering, and corporate espionage." Megan consulted her phone as if checking a grocery list. "Yes, we know all about the real power of the Reynolds family, including the $2 billion currently moving through shell companies in the Cayman Islands." All the color drained from Elizabeth's face. "How did you—" "James Chen sends his regards," George said smoothly. "He was very cooperative once we showed him proof of his father's involvement in Victoria's schemes. Amazing how quickly loyalty crumbles when faced with federal prosecution." "You're bluffing." But Elizabeth's hands shook as she reached for her briefcase. "The Shanghai board has already voted." Megan nodded toward the doorway, where Robert stood with a group of board members. "Unanimously in favor of the merger. While you were flying here to present your takeover proposal, we were closing the deal." "That's impossible. The vote wasn't scheduled until we rescheduled it," George finished. "You see, Elizabeth, you made the same mistake Victoria did. You assumed that because I married Megan for strategic reasons, she was just another pawn in the game. You never considered that she might make me stronger, smarter, better." "We're not just husband and wife," Megan added, genuine warmth coloring her voice. "We're partners, and partners protect each other." Elizabeth looked between them, her carefully constructed plan crumbling before her eyes. "This isn't over," she snarled. "The Reynolds family is finished." Robert stepped forward, holding up his phone. "The FBI just raided your offices in Boston. Christina Porter is already in custody. And that $2 billion you were trying to hide, it's been frozen pending investigation. You'll never prove any of it." Elizabeth said, but her voice held more desperation than conviction. "We don't have to." George's smile was almost pitying. "Your own people are doing that for us. It's amazing how many loyal employees suddenly remember old conversations when faced with criminal charges." The board members began filing in, carefully avoiding Elizabeth's eyes. She stood frozen, watching as her carefully constructed world collapsed around her. "You should call your lawyer," Megan suggested kindly. "I hear the FBI is offering deals to anyone who cooperates fully, though you might want to avoid the firm in the Caymans. They've been quite helpful to us lately." As security arrived to escort Elizabeth Reynolds from the building, Megan felt George's arms wrap around her from behind. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he murmured in her ear. "Too late." She turned in his embrace, smiling up at him. "You already did, remember? Something about keeping secrets and trying to protect me? And you made me pay for it." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Rather spectacularly, as I recall." "Yes, well." Megan straightened his tie one last time. "Sometimes the people we love need a reminder that they're not alone anymore." The Shanghai board was waiting to finalize the merger. Their victory was complete, and the Reynolds family's reign of corporate terror was ending. But as George led her into the conference room, his hand warm against her back, Megan knew that their greatest triumph wasn't in the contracts they'd sign or the empire they'd protected. It was in the trust they'd built, the partnership they'd forged, and the love that had transformed them both from careful strategists into something far more powerful. Two people who faced every battle knowing that together they were unbeatable. 1 year to the day after Megan had first entered George Blackwood's office to sign their marriage contract, she stood in the same spot, watching dawn paint the Boston skyline. The office had changed since then. Family photos now dotted his desk. Her father's compass sat in a place of honor beside his computer, and a framed newspaper article hung on the wall, its headline declaring, "Reynolds family empire crumbles as Blackwood power couple triumphs." "You're here early." Megan turned to find George in the doorway, 2 coffee cups in hand. He'd loosened his tie, a habit he'd developed only recently, one of many small ways he'd softened over the past year. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, accepting the coffee. "Too many memories." "Good ones or bad?" "Both." She moved to his desk, picking up the silver compass. "I was so scared that day, did you know? Not of you, exactly. More of losing myself in this arrangement." George set down his coffee and pulled her into his arms. "And now?" "Now I know that I didn't lose myself. At all." She smiled up at him. "I found the person I was always meant to be. We both did." The intercom buzzed before he could respond. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, they're ready for you in the conference room." Today marked more than just their anniversary. Today, they would announce the merger of Blackwood Industries and Carlton Industries, not through contracts or coercion, but through a true partnership. The board had voted unanimously in favor, their faith in the couple's combined leadership cemented by their handling of the Reynolds crisis. "Ready?" George offered his arm. "Almost." Megan reached into her bag and withdrew an envelope. The original marriage contract, now coffee-stained and worn from being carried as a reminder. "I think it's time we properly dealt with this." George took the contract, studying it for a moment before walking to his desk. He opened a drawer and withdrew. A lighter, the same one he'd used to light celebratory cigars after their Shanghai victory. Without hesitation, he set the corner of the contract aflame and dropped it into his metal waste bin. They watched it burn together, the flames consuming the legal language that had once defined their relationship. When only ashes remained, George pulled Megan close and pressed a kiss to her temple. "I have something for you, too." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small box. "George, Megan opened it to find a delicate gold chain holding a miniature compass pendant. "It's beautiful. I had it made from part of your father's compass." He fastened it around her neck. "The original stays here, marking where our journey began, but this one—" His fingers lingered on the pendant. "This is to remind you that no matter where life takes us, we'll always find our way together." Tears pricked at Megan's eyes. "When did you become so sentimental?" "When my convenient marriage turned into the best decision I ever made." He wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek, though I still maintained throwing wine in my face was unnecessary. Megan laughed, the sound bright and free. "It worked, didn't it? Got your attention." "Megan," his voice softened, "you've always had my attention. From that first day when you demanded changes to the contract, I just didn't know then that you'd end up changing so much more than a few legal clauses." The intercom buzzed again, more insistent this time. They really were keeping everyone waiting. But before they left the office, Megan pulled George down for a proper kiss, one that held all the love, trust, and partnership they'd built over the past year. "Let's go tell them," she said when they finally parted. The conference room was packed. Board members, key employees, and even Robert, who'd flown in specially for the announcement. As George and Megan took their places at the head of the table, the room fell silent with anticipation. "1 year ago," George began, his voice carrying easily through the space, "I made what appeared to be a business decision, a marriage of convenience, designed to protect corporate interests and maintain public image." He looked at Megan, his eyes soft. "What I actually did was make the best personal decision of my life." Megan squeezed his hand as he continued. "Today, we're announcing the complete merger of Blackwood Industries and Carlton Industries. Not because of contracts or obligations, but because we've learned that true strength comes from unity, from trust, from partnership." "Some of you were here last year when we fought the Reynolds family," Megan added. "You saw firsthand how powerful we could be together. That victory wasn't just about business strategy. It was about proving that when we combine our strengths, support each other's weaknesses, and face challenges as one, we're unstoppable." The room erupted in applause, but Megan barely heard it. She was lost in George's eyes, seeing there all the love and pride she felt reflected back at her. Later that evening, they stood on their penthouse balcony, watching the sun set over the city that had witnessed their entire journey. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the promise of change and new beginnings. "Do you ever regret it?" George asked suddenly. "Signing that contract?" Megan touched the compass pendant at her throat, thinking of all the twists and turns that had led them here. "How can I regret something that gave me everything I never knew I wanted? Even the controlling, overprotective parts. Especially in those," she turned in his arms, smiling up at him, "because they showed me the real George Blackwood, the man who cares so deeply he sometimes forgets to let others care back. The man who had to learn that true love isn't about protection or control, but about standing together, facing whatever comes." "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd been through together. "I love you, too." Megan laid her head on his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. "Even when you drive me crazy with your need to manage every detail," says the woman who color codes her hospital volunteer schedule. "It's called being organized." Their laughter mingled in the evening air, a sound of pure joy and comfortable intimacy that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Below them, Boston continued its endless rhythm, unaware that its most powerful couple had found something far more valuable than corporate success or social status. They had found each other. And in doing so, they had discovered that the greatest business deal of all was the one that transformed a contract into a covenant, an arrangement into an adventure, and two careful strategists into soulmates who faced Life's battles side by side, stronger together than they ever could have been apart. The compass pendant caught the last rays of sunlight, its arrow pointing true north. But Megan and George had learned that sometimes the best direction wasn't on any map. It was the path you created together, one step at a time, with love as your guide and trust as your compass. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.